earlier on before the meditation, I was sharing what a beautiful day it was. And then suddenly now we have here a beautiful thunderstorming rainstorm in the tropics. So what a great experience of impermanence that is. And so we're going to be here, listening to a Dharma talk. And essentially, Dharma means truth of nature. And I think traditionally, a lot of our sages and our teachers from our historical past had based a lot of their learnings on how nature presented itself. So again, Carol guided us into a beautiful meditation about impermanence and not self. And I remember being a teenager, especially growing up in Minnesota, of all places. And I was very much, I would swing my moods based on the weather. And I did not like winter at all, especially because I was born in the tropics. And it was too cold in Minnesota. So now that I'm a little bit older, the weather doesn't shake me as much. But yes, of course, it's still a practice. And this is the reason why we're here. So I'm going to be sharing with you today what I titled Healing the Divide. And this is based on the Buddha's teachings. And based on my studies, also put a little bit of some science in there as well. So by no means is this out of my own opinion. It's also a little bit of my geekiness with Buddhism. So for those who are new to Buddhism, I invite you to have an open mind and heart. I will be sharing a couple of stories, and I know that there's a tendency for some of us to get sleepy when we listen to stories. That might be a condition that we have for bedtime. So I invite you, if you're able to remember, if you notice at any certain point during the storytelling time that you feel sleepy, you can cover your left nostril and breathe in and out through the right nostril, because this is what I learned from my ashram in India. That engages your brain to stay awake. Okay? Yes, in and out through the right nostril. I used to do that in class. Stay awake. So I'm going to share my screen. And so again, I titled this talk, Healing the Divide, Peace Through the Buddha's Teachings. And so the Buddha's poem of peace, hatred never ends by hatred. By love alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. And this is from the Dhammapada, verse 5. So the Madhupindika Sutta, which is from the Majjhima Nikaya 18, is called the ball of honey. In this discourse, the Buddha... Wow. Okay. I think my car alarm is going off, but it will... Oh my gosh. Anyway, so the discourse is about how the Buddha taught about conflict, and pretty much how do we work with conflict, or at least not entertain the conflict in our lives? Because ultimately, the teachings of the Buddha is about suffering and the cessation of suffering. And ultimately, these practices were taught to us so that we can find that balance and harmony within ourselves. So the Madhupindika Sutta is about the one day when the Buddha decided to go for a walk into the deep forest. And it was a great forest in the Banyan Park. And he went to sit down and contemplate in this clump of fresh bamboo. And while he's sitting there, another might have been a family member of his name is Dandapani, which means stick in hand. Dandapani is also from the Sakyan tribe, and he might have been a cousin of the Buddha, but he had this reputation for being already very conceited since he was young. And he would carry a golden stick in his hand, and that's the reason why he's called that, Dandapani, or stick in hand. So he was going for his exercises and ended up also going into the great forest, and then encountered the Buddha while he was sitting there. And because he was already well known for being a bit more, conceited, and also he liked to, incite conflict. So the Buddha already had, an idea what he was going for. And so as Dandapani was approaching the Buddha, he asked him, "What is your doctrine? What do you proclaim in your teachings?" And without saying much, the Buddha went straight to telling him, "What sort of doctrine that I teach? The doctrine that I teach is where one does not keep quarreling with anyone in the cosmos, with its devas, maras, and brahmas, with its contemplatives and Brahmins, its royalty and common folk, where perceptions no longer obsess the way the Brahmin who remains dissociated from sensuality, free from perplexity, his uncertainty cut away, devoid of craving for becoming, and none." So, in other words, the Buddha had already seen the intention of Dandapani as he was approaching. And the Buddha already said what he needed to say to cut Dandapani at the root of this conflict. So he said, I teach the doctrine in which I avoid conflict with all beings. That's including the devas. That's including all living beings, seen and unseen. So for him, he just really avoided, but I don't think it was more an avoidance because, there's certain way that we can also do that. But then for him, he knew the skillful ways to already stop the conflict at its tracks. Okay, so Papancha is what he teaches us is the reason for all of this conflict that arises. It's like a proliferation of our minds. It's when we create an object, like this object, we identify with it. And so we bring a sense of self to things that arise in our mind. And Papancha, in the research, the scientific research by Nandini Karunamuni, and he says that rumination and excessive mental proliferation are significant transdiagnostic factors in the manifestation of a variety of emotional disorders. So what he's saying ultimately is that when we get stuck in the past and we keep replaying certain things and ruminate about stories and experiences that we had, or maybe also worrying about the future, so there's this excess of mental movement. We're constantly thinking, we're always up here in our minds. Then that's when we start having difficulty with our emotional states. So I would love to invite you, if you can, I'm going to stop sharing for the moment so I can see you. I'd love to ask you, how do you experience conflict within yourself? Are there ways that you experience conflict? Just by putting it in the chat box. Thanks, Julio. So how do you experience conflict, doubt and self-doubt. Yes, thank you. Heart racing, overthinking, and doubt about choices, avoiding it, but I feel it in my stomach and worry about it and fester with it. Wanting two competing things at the same time, yes. When I hold myself and others to impossible or antagonistic standards. Compulsiveness, long and complex discourse, often along with shaming and blaming. Indecision, too many options, not enough time. Fear, anxiety, insecurity, rumination. Yes, thank you. And all of these things are valid. There's ways definitely that we can experience the division within ourselves, like there's incongruence. Maybe we don't walk our talk and then we judge ourselves. There's fear, angst, rigidity, continuous mental spinning. Yes, wanting my pain to be noticed. So yes, definitely. When I do not practice what I need. Yeah, definitely. So there's that conflict. Very often it's really because we want to stop suffering, that pain, it's really about that. So what a beautiful thing that we have the Buddha teaching us these things. I experience conflict between my desires and needs. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'll go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so, right. Just a moment here because I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do it without it playing like it's on. Let's see, there it's playing. There we go. Okay. All right, so then we experience internal conflict within ourselves, and also we experience conflict outside of ourselves. Okay, so then there's ways that we can create a selfing and an othering. So the way that we create a divided world within ourselves and others is maybe just, by all of the discrimination that we feel, that we experience, and that perhaps, toward ourselves and then toward others. So there's all of these ways that we can create division, and that others create division as well. So yes, and I think that we're very familiar with these things. So here in the Philippines, it's very much about social classes. There's ageism that we experience here quite a lot, and then education and professional titles. And so all of these things are very much a part of our worldly experience. So what is taught to us is, okay, there we go. So the Buddha teaches us about the three poisons. So we've got greed, hatred, and delusion, and these are the roots of our suffering. So when we experience greed, it's more because we love something, that there's something that we are so much identified with, the things that we experience as pleasurable. And when it feels like it's being threatened, then we start to also defend it. And then there's also the hatred that we experience from things that are not pleasurable, that might be painful, that don't match up to our own ways of seeing things, our views and our belief systems. And then the delusion comes in because we are not quite clear. We have, when we're deluded, we have a tendency to shy away, maybe to hide from things. It's also possible for us to just push it under the rug, and not see things, not want to see it, or not see things clearly. So the Buddha teaches us about papancha. Papancha, again, is that proliferation. So when we view the world as objects, we cling to them. So this is where that greed comes in, that desire as me, mine, and I. And when we do that, we have a particular way that we impose our views. When we categorize things, we impose our views on the world. And this is how we get into conflict, because it's not agreeing with the way that we would like for the world to be. So Friedrich Nietzsche says that little do we see a tree exactly and completely with reference to leaves, twigs, color, and form. So it's very easy for us to simply improvise some approximation of a tree. So we have our ways, like biases and of how we see things. Like a tree, we might like a particular part of a tree, or might see only certain parts of a tree. I know, based on my own experience, I used to go to Thailand for my retreats, and there was this beautiful banyan tree that I liked to climb up. And I would spend my time at just, at a branch, sitting on a branch of this tree for quite some time. And I noticed while I watched people come and go that very few people actually looked up at the tree. So there's that experience of maybe our view is just more here within eye level. And so we might see the roots and the trunk, but not necessarily the branches and the leaves and perhaps the flowers and the fruit. So it depends on what we perceive in our personal experience. So there's a story that I would like to share with you, and some of you might already be familiar with it. And okay, so I'll keep that image there for a moment. So this is a story that teaches us intercultural awareness. And so this is illustrating how perspectives can lead to different points of view. So I'm going to stop sharing for the moment, and I'm going to tell you the story. And I'll try to make it short because I've had Carol tell me it was too long at one point before. And so again, I'd love for you to just open up, relax, and listen to this story about the blind man and the elephant. Long ago, 6 old men lived in a village in India. Each was born blind. The other villagers loved the old men and kept them away from harm. Since the blind men couldn't see the world for themselves, they had to imagine many of its wonders. They listened carefully to the stories told by travelers to learn what they could about life outside the village. And then these men were curious about many of the stories they heard, but they were most curious about elephants. They were told that elephants could trample forests, carry huge burdens, and frighten young and old with their loud trumpet calls. But they also knew that the Raja's daughter rode an elephant when she traveled in her father's kingdom. Would the Raja let his daughter get near such a dangerous creature? So the old man argued all day and all night about elephants. So the elephant must be a powerful giant. So he had heard stories about elephants being used to clear forests and build roads. And then, no, you're wrong. An elephant must be graceful and gentle if a princess has to ride on its back. You're wrong. I've heard that an elephant can pierce a man's heart with its terrible horn. Oh, please, says the fourth blind man. You're all mistaken. An elephant is nothing more than a large sort of cow. You know how people exaggerate. And I'm sure that an elephant is something magical, said the fifth blind man. That would explain why the Raja's daughter can travel safely through the kingdom. And then the sixth blind man says, I don't believe elephants exist at all. I think we're all victims of a cruel joke. And so everyone had their own different perception. And so finally, the villagers agreed to bring them to an elephant so that they can experience the elephant for themselves. And so the way that the villagers would lead these men, one of them would come to the front, and then the the blind men, one after the other, would place a hand on the shoulder of one of the villagers leading them, and then they would walk together, and then another villager behind them. So this is how much they were loved. So the villager brought them to one of the elephants, and then what they did was they got to the elephant, and then each of them went to one part of the elephant. And so one blind man says, "An elephant is smooth and solid like a wall. So it must be very powerful," he declared. Just like that thunder. And then the second blind man put his hand on the elephant's limber trunk. And then he says, "An elephant is like a giant snake." And then the third blind man felt the elephant's pointed tusk. "I was right," he decided. "The creature is as sharp and deadly as a spear." And then the fourth blind man touched one of the elephant's four legs. "Oh, what we have here is an extremely large cow." And then the fifth man says, "I believe an elephant is like a huge fan, or maybe a magic carpet that can fly over mountains and treetops," because he was feeling the elephant's ear. And then the sixth blind man gave a tug on the elephant's coarse tail. "Why, this is nothing more than a piece of old rope. Dangerous indeed." So the gardener and the villager brought them under the tree. And while they sat under the tree, they argued about how it's a spear, it's a wall, it's a cow, and it's a magic carpet. It's only a rope. And they kept arguing until the Raj, who was at the castle nearby, overheard them while he was resting. And so he went outside and he finally talked to the old man. He said, "How can you be so sure that you're right?" So the Raja asked. The Raja says, "The elephant is a very large animal. Each man touched only one part. Perhaps if you put the parts together, you'll see the truth. Now let me finish my nap in peace." And so finally, the blind men realized that they were only experiencing one part of truth. And then they decided that they would go back home to their village, and they were led back home to the villagers, and they felt a little bit more enlightened from that experience. So maybe some of us might have some stories like that where we hold a certain perception, and then maybe family members are very likely it's the family members that we have disagreements with, and they have their own experience and their own perception. And that's where conflicts happen, because we're only seeing one part of that truth. So that's the story's, the lesson of the story there. Okay. So we have the three realms of experience that the Buddha has taught us about, right? And these are the experience of our lives. So there's pain and stress and suffering this is again the reason why many of us have come to this practice and to these teachings, because we want to be liberated from the stress and the suffering that is inherent in life. There's also impermanence or anicca, and it allows us to cope more easily with trying times. So it's great to be able to remember that things are not going to last forever. So when we realize that certain experiences in life is not permanent, then we're more likely to react with grace when things are taken away from us, like perhaps even people that we love. There's also the experience of non-self. So they say that depression, anxiety, mental illness, hatred, greed, poverty, war are all examples of internal suffering. So our internal suffering is the product of this selfing that brings us to a place where we feel separated from others and nature. So it's important with this proliferation of the mind to see how you create your sense of self and the world out there, to see it as a process and an activity of the mind rather than it being mine. This is, the objectification that many people experience and how they live their lives, because there's such an attachment and identification. So it's best to create, just do it. Live life as if it were a process of impermanence, and that even with your meditation, you can experience firsthand how impermanent our experiences are and how impermanent things are with nature, just as I'm experiencing right now, the weather. Life is just like the weather changing. And even with all of the proliferation in our mind, how we can also step back, relax, and look at all of the thoughts that are plaguing us and see our mind as a sky, a vast blue sky where the thoughts are like clouds and we just watch them come and go. And this is really one of the prescriptions that the Buddha has shared with us so that we can be relieved of the stress and the suffering because of how much our minds work. And, the mind is really conditioned to be this way. So there's nothing wrong with us if the mind is constantly moving in that way. And this is why it's such a great thing that you're here, because you're doing something very radical to actually train your mind in a way that will help you find more peace and calm. Okay, so just checking the time. Right. So some of the ways that we create a selfing through the Buddha's teachings is he talks about the 5 clinging aggregates, or these are some of the groupings that we have as what makes up as our entire experience of our lives. So as if it were like the elephant, there are different parts of it. Our experience with our lives has also 5 different parts. Okay, so these experiences are ever changing and we can't grasp onto them. They're impermanent. And so what it does is it gives rise to stress and suffering because we can't possibly find a self in any of these experiences of ourselves, like our body, which is form. And in Pali, the language that the Buddha spoke is called rupa. So it's our physical body. Traditionally, these are our sense organs, like the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the sixth mind, or part of our sense organ, is the mind. Okay, and so it's also experienced as the material forms outside of ourselves with regard to different bodies of other people, and then material belongings, perhaps. So form is that. And that's one of those things where we can become so identified with our bodies. One of the things that's a universal experience with our bodies is maybe some pain or illness that we might experience at certain points of our lives. And when our body is not functioning as well as we would like it to, we start to we experience pain physically, also emotionally, and then we add more emotional difficulty when we start judging and criticizing our bodies for not being as healthy as we want it to be. The great thing about this practice, though, is that when we sit with our bodies in stillness, the body will speak to us. It will tell us will give us some warnings in sensations, in forms of sensations, and that we can stay healthier for the most part when we pay attention to our bodies and the signals that it gives us. The second aggregate is Vedana, or feeling. Not necessarily emotions. Vedana is what you experience in your body, including pain and pleasure, and also neutral sensations. So it's either pleasurable or it's not pleasurable or neutral. Without going into the stories, because what happens generally is if there's something that we're experiencing that is not pleasurable, we have a tendency to push away these things or run away from it. There's also occasions that you might freeze. And then with the pleasurable experiences, we have a tendency to cling tightly to these things. We want to keep it for as long as we can. And if it's possible, let's keep it for the rest of our lives, right? And then there's also the neutral feelings. And generally, when there's sensations that are neutral, we don't notice them very easily. So there's parts in our body that we might not notice a lot. Like for me personally, the back of my ears, I don't feel the backs behind my ears a lot. So there's parts where that we don't notice very much. And those are some of the blind spots that might show up for us eventually, these neutral things. And so I have also learned to pay more attention to those things that are neutral, because inevitably that will lead to delusion. So the Vedana is very much related to the three roots of suffering. It's the desire for pleasure, the aversion to pain, and the delusion when there's neutral things that are present for us. There's also sanya, or the perception. And so with these sense organs that we talked about with our body, there's the way that we perceive things, like how our eyes see things, and then immediately a story might arise. So think about maybe an experience or an occasion in your life where you see something, and then there's this immediate reaction in your body, and then the thoughts that come up in your mind. Like, let's say your favorite food, a plate full of your most favorite decadent food, and it's plated in the most beautiful way. Imagine seeing that and what arises for you. So this is an example of perception. And then if somebody were to put the most disgusting, unpalatable food for you in your experience in front of you, what arises for you there? So these are the perceptions that we have, and that's according and very much related to how we see things, hear things, smell, taste, and feel on our skin. And then with all of these experiences, we have this, propensity to fabricate stories. So all of our concepts and our thoughts. So from the most mundane, like eating your most favorite food, into the most grand ideas, like how you envision your future, how you would love to see your life manifest, So these are all stories that we create, and we also get attached to these things. We create a sense of self around what stories we create. And then the fifth aggregate is all the awareness, your consciousness, and awareness of all of this experience, from the body, the feelings, the perception, and all the fabrication. So it's, even when you sit in meditation, noticing your body and the thoughts arise, and all of these ever-changing experience that you notice arising and passing, even with just the 30 minutes of meditation that Carol led us through. How life just ebbs and flows, just like the surf in the ocean, the waves in the ocean. And the more that we get attached to the way that life flows, and if we want it a certain way, the more we create pain and stress for ourselves. And so the prescription is for us to see things as they are without creating too many stories or biases. And I know that's not easy, but to allow life to live itself and flow with a sense of just being an observer, a witness to all of it. And there's also this question, if I decide that I'm not going to get too attached to certain social justice work or issues, or maybe issues at home, like one of the questions that I had for myself was, if I'm supposed to be calm and cool all the time because of my practice, how am I supposed to discipline my children? How do I do that? Well, it's not about just sitting back and doing nothing, because a lot of the time, if you do that and if you avoid what's arising for you with regard to the painful or even the pleasurable experiences in your life, that could be spiritual bypass. It's possibly just, okay, I'm just going to meditate so I can be calm and free and loving all the time. So what we do when we spiritually bypass is we suppress and we avoid facing the difficult things in our lives. So, maybe some unresolved emotional issues or wounds and some unfinished work. I know for me also, I have this anxiety when people call my phone. I have this anxiety since I was a teenager. I can't seem to, I'm not excited to answer any phone calls. And so that's one of those examples that has translated to like emails for me. So there's this unfinished task that I always have in my email inbox. And then it proliferates. Like I can hear my mind talking badly about myself because I can't seem to get that part of my work done. So I'm still definitely working on it. But those are some of the things that we do where we actually avoid doing things that might be physical or it's emotional, maybe even also mental. So, it's part of our work also to understand, are we bypassing this with even the spiritual work that we're doing? Maybe the meditation we're using as a way to avoid rather than to face things. So the way for us to actually work with all of the conflict within us, because what shows up inside internally translates outside. And the prescription here with our formal practices is to be able to deconstruct the conflict. So what we do is we investigate. Where's the stress? Where's that pain? And what's causing it? One of the practices that a lot of people do with emotional pain is the RAIN practice. Some of you might be familiar with that. RAIN is the acronym for recognize, and it's acknowledging that it's there, allowing for it to be there. I for investigate. So that's that. It's deconstructing it. You ask questions. Where is it? Where do I feel it in my body? What's coming up for me? What are the thoughts that arise when the stress arises for me? And then the N is for not self or not identifying. And then there's also other teachers that have changed that to nurture. As to not spiritually bypass, you might stay with it and befriend whatever is arising there. So what we want to do is start peeling away these things so that we can understand them better, so that we can also learn to accept them and also understand the culture, whatever it is that we learned from our families, from our traditions, because there's a lot of the things from our culture that we accepted that we didn't realize. So another formal practice is meditation. And in Pali, it's called samadhi. Okay, and this is the cultivating patience and self-control, engaging in ethical behavior. So there's the sila, and nurturing positive emotions like compassion, and especially self-compassion. When we're working through this, we need to be very kind and compassionate toward ourselves. We're not sitting in meditation just to, suck it up, stay with what's there. We need to also know and be able to discern how much we're going to sit with and how much we're able to befriend at that moment. So when you're meditating, and there's also a way for you to titrate and pendulate. You don't have to sit with all the difficulty, because that has the possibility to bring up more painful emotions and thoughts. So you can first notice certain parts of your body, perhaps, or experience that feels positive or that feels easy. And you can identify that within your experience of that moment. And then when you're working through something difficult also at that moment, then you can touch into that place, that painful place. And then see for yourself, how much do I want to stay here? And then come back out of it for a moment, go back into that easy place. Give yourself some resources where you're not diving right into it, because that's not something that you would want to do if in case you're working with something very difficult or traumatic. You don't want to re-traumatize yourself. So bringing in positive emotions, loving kindness, compassion, forgiveness, that's also really important when we do this type of work, and just, really deconstructing all of this. Goodwill, metta, or kindness encourages healthy mental attitudes. So it helps also with promoting healing and harmony amongst ourselves and all beings around us. So the practice of bringing metta or loving kindness to ourselves, and then we bring that outward to someone that is easy to love, and then maybe some neutral person, or if you're able to, we can start working towards somebody who is not so easy. But that's up to you too. That's a matter of you deciding how much you're able to engage in at any certain point during your practice, while you sit formally, also as you live your life in an engaged way, because it's so important to also be active. Compassion and metta is something that is an action. It's not passive. And especially compassion, it's the desire to want to help and change things. I just really wanted to bring that to you, and I wasn't able to finish the slides. It's really rich. This teaching is so rich. So, I hope that was useful for you. And please just take in what you find beneficial at this time, and whatever feels like it's a little bit too much, you can set it aside for now. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Carol, for doing that. I really needed it.
It was beautiful. Thank you. I appreciated the talk. It's so good to invite the beginner's mind and to really wrestle, because things are constant all the time for all of us. And thank you.
And also working with all of the thunder and all of the rain that's happening. And wow, it's just, also being here in this seat and working through all of my personal confusion of whether or not you're able to hear me over the thunder, or if you can even hear the thunder. So it's interesting. It's a lovely practice.